A broke Los Angeles DJ stumbles into a laundering scheme tied to the Mexican Mafia, becomes the perfect ghost behind a $5 million transfer, and decides to keep the money. What follows is a spiral of paranoia, love turned into leverage, and a brutal choice between disappearing or finally telling the truth. If you want more raw, real confessions like this, subscribe. I used to think bass could hide anything. You crank it loud enough, it drowns out the shaky hands, the bar tab you promised to settle next week, the roommate who texts in all caps about rent. I played midweek slots on Pico and late-night sets in a warehouse 2 blocks from where the city turns to shadows. I was a background guy for other people's weekends, a gap filler between couples who fought on the dance floor and made up in the parking lot. I wasn't proud, but I was useful, and useful people get to hang around longer than pretty ones. The good nights paid in cash in a wrinkled envelope with a stamp of some off-brand tequila on it. The bad nights paid in drink tickets. Most of them smelled like bleach and old smoke. Los Angeles looks glossy from the right angle, but bend down and touch any surface and you feel the stick. That stick was my life, and I had made peace with it. I told myself art was supposed to be hungry. The hunger kept me light on my feet, which I figured was virtue, not failure. I met him on a Tuesday, which is the kind of night when nobody important should show up. He wore a bomber jacket that had been expensive 2 years ago and sunglasses inside like his eyes were a secret. He didn't ask for a song, he asked if I knew how to listen. It was a dumb line, but I said yes because I always say yes. He leaned in close and explained that he had a friend who needed a favor. A favor so boring it barely counted as a crime, and I laughed because people who use the word favor like that never pick up the check. He said what he needed was a person who understood sound, someone who could build a set around the frequencies of a room and know where the dead spots were. I told him that wasn't a favor, that was my job. He smiled in a way that told me he planned to take credit for me later. Then he put his number in my phone and wrote it under a name that wasn't his. He told me to text from a number that wasn't mine and handed me a cheap burner. I put it in my pocket and kept the music going like any of this was normal. The next afternoon he took me to a storage unit outside Commerce. It looked like all storage units, which is to say it looked like denial with a padlock. Inside, there was just a folding table, a folding chair, and a metal case with a foam interior cut to fit the kind of gear you don't buy in a store. He opened it and showed me a portable rig that could sniff and reroute signals in a way that sounded like wizardry. And I nodded like I understood it all. My job, he said, would be to set a mood at an invite-only event in a Glendale banquet hall, keep the crowd drunk and loud, and run a second board behind the booth. He told me it would be a long night but a safe one, and I'd walk out with more money than my car was worth. What he didn't say, not until much later, was who the friends were. He didn't say who was moving what under the table, and who had the kind of reach that made cops shrug and go on vacation. He didn't say Mexican Mafia. He just asked me if I liked clean gigs that involved dirty work and promised I'd never have to touch a weapon. The silence around the missing details felt like a test. I passed by pretending not to notice. That first night, I wore black on black and didn't meet anyone's eyes longer than necessary. The banquet hall had faux gold trim and a chandelier trying to be a star. The crowd was business casual plus a few tattoos you weren't supposed to read. The music was easy, mid-tempo, warm, nothing that asked questions. Behind the booth, I had the ghost rig under a towel. I was just a guy turning knobs, and nobody looked twice. I played the track slow and smooth to keep the room's attention fuzzy while the back office counted things that didn't belong in a ledger. When it was over, when the staff had swept the last line wedge into a black bag, my bomber jacket friend said I'd done good and handed me an envelope. It was thick. I didn't count it. I never count in front of people who act like they're doing you a favor. At home, I poured the cash on the kitchen table, counted it twice, and put it back in the envelope without smiling. I don't know why. Maybe I knew even then that every number gets paid for, one way or another. I started sleeping less and waking up with the taste of metal. It wasn't guilt. Guilt is a story you tell yourself when you want to feel noble. This was something more practical, the sudden awareness that life comes with fine print. The next gigs happened without questions, and I stopped asking which ones were the real shows and which ones were smokescreens. I kept my head down and my playlists busy. I told myself I was a contractor, a freelance atmosphere provider. It sounded laughable even in my own head, but I was good at it, and in Los Angeles being good is enough to get you invited back. The third month, when the money had started to look like proof that I wasn't a joke, someone finally said the name out loud. Not to me, not directly. It was a throwaway in a corner near the ice machine. The Mexican Mafia wanted all the middlemen to act smarter and more boring. Smart and boring people do not end up in court. They end up in new houses with the same old worries. I didn't run then because running is a decision, and I kept telling myself I hadn't decided anything. I was just playing music in rooms where decisions were made. If you want to know how a person like me gets from that to $5 million, it's simple. A dozen little rationalizations, each one small enough to swallow without choking, and then a single big moment where you choose who you are. That moment was waiting for me without a plan, and the cruel thing is it chose a night when I felt almost happy. I had regulars on the floor who asked about my mixes. I had a girl who liked to sit on the subwoofer during soundcheck because she said it felt like a heartbeat. I had a jacket that finally fit. That's when the city usually puts a bed on your table and waits to see if you touch it. That night came with a number I couldn't ignore, and a window I never thought I'd see open. The silence around what it would cost me was louder than any crowd I had ever played for. I wish I could say I chose the money because I was desperate. The truth is I chose the money because I was tired, and tired people do stupid brave things. The window was a spreadsheet and a routine. It was a Tuesday noon in a Koreatown cafe that cleaned the tables with the same cloth and poured coffee that tasted like someone else's dream. The bomber jacket guy had slid into the seat across from me with a face that looked carved out of a late bill. He told me our next event wasn't at a banquet hall. It was at an escrow office front in a strip mall where the sun made the asphalt look like it could swallow you whole. My job would be to run ambience, same as always, but there would be a timing element. Certain transfers thrived on mood the way seeds thrive on rain, and my rhythms had turned out to be unusually good rain. By then I knew exactly what my rig was doing behind the towel. It wasn't just sniffing, it was nudging. Pushing packets to line up with ghosts so they could pass through a different door while the camera was blinking. There were layers of it, and I only understood the surface. The surface was enough to know I was a tiny gear in a machine that moved sums with names like client fees and vendor reimbursement. The machine loved me because I was invisible even when people were looking at me. DJs make sure the night belongs to the room. It turns out that's also a perfect software metaphor. The 5 million didn't show up as a number on a briefcase. It showed up as a timing block in the pipeline, an amount too big to blend into the usual flow. Even I knew it. The window was 40 minutes when a flag could be fooled into thinking a legitimate remittance needed to be re-verified, which would route it through a side process for a manual green light. Manual green lights are human and therefore corruptible. The crew that rented my silence had momentum inside that manual process. My role was mood and decoys. A plausible disruption in the main room, a nudge in the network, a reboot that looked accidental but wasn't, a spreadsheet that matched the lie just long enough. I say these things like I was the mastermind. I wasn't. I was the guy with steady hands and a calm voice who made other people's plans seem normal. But plans are like beats. Once you've worked with them long enough, you learn where the breaks are, and you figure out where a drop would hit hardest if you wanted to surprise the room. The window was built for a clean reroute. I saw where a second, dirtier reroute could live inside it if the light hit it right. Not a steal so much as an edit. Change the destination down the chain after all the authorization stamps were satisfied and the paper already said yes. A second yes that looked like the first one to any tired eyes. The idea felt like a buzzing under my skin. I tried to ignore it. I tried to remember the names people had thrown around near the ice machine, and what happens to men who improvise on the wrong night. I forced myself to think about my girl on the subwoofer, and how she laughed at nothing. I told myself a dozen stories about responsibility and patience. But the math kept writing itself on every wall. The window. The timing. The way the ghost rig could be ghosted again. The way 5 million was a lot in any city, but in Los Angeles it was infection and cure at the same time. If you want to judge me, do it now. I was small time and painted myself as a purist to survive the shame of it. I took the envelopes and told myself music needed me more than I needed honesty. That Tuesday, with the spreadsheet open and the coffee cold, I made the decision that killed whatever decent version of me was left. I decided to build a second shadow into a room full of shadows and take everything the big machine was already stealing, only point it somewhere else, somewhere that had my name on it, and no one else's fingerprints. I didn't do it alone. I couldn't. There are always accomplices in crimes you tell yourself are solo. Mine wasn't a person I would have chosen. It was a contractor who maintained the event space's network gear, a hardware nerd with a neck tattoo of a chess knight, and a limp from a skateboarding accident that probably wasn't an accident. He flirted with the bartender and charged overtime to switch out whatever the clipboard said needed switching. I had watched him long enough to know he liked puzzles and money in equal measure. I told him I had a puzzle and a way to make the money part private. He told me puzzles get boring when they come with blood. We built the cutout on paper first, then in a sandbox he pretended was for an art installation. We rehearsed the timing down to the breath. The second reroute would only be alive for 8 minutes and would die if touched. It required me to be both at the board and at my own board inside it, which meant I needed chaos around me to justify the stillness in my face. We planned a feedback loop at the exact moment the transfer pushed through the manual green light. The reboot would force the system to cough. The cough would excuse my hands. The system's watchdog would be looking in the wrong place for the wrong problem. Meanwhile, my second ghost would whisper a new account number that shared 8 digits with the original, a number I had opened 2 weeks earlier through a cutout in a different state with an identity I rented from a friend of a friend who liked fake watches. The night came dressed like any other, which is how big nights prefer it. The room was tight with money smell and cologne that tried too hard. I did my job. I kept the BPMs humble and the attention sloppy. I waited for the timing block to light up in the corner of the screen only I could see. When it did, I breathed in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the way a vape pen yoga instructor once told me was good for anxiety. I pressed the thing that looked like an accident but wasn't, and the room hiccuped. Glass clinked. The staff looked annoyed. The back end did exactly what the plan said it would do. The manual green light smiled at its own reflection and signed off. What happened next happened in 8 minutes. The second ghost woke, wrote new digits where old ones were, and went back to sleep without saying goodbye. The transfer slid into a shape no one would recognize unless they already suspected the shape existed. The money didn't fall into my lap. It fell into a cold place with no name, and waited like a dog told to sit. The room cheered for a birthday, and I cheered with them. I smiled with my mouth and kept my eyes flat. I wiped the rig with a clean cloth and complimented the manager on his ice machine. I packed my gear so slowly it felt like a tantrum. I walked to my car and drove the longest short drive of my life. The next 72 hours felt like swallowing glass one sliver at a time. No alarms. No calls. No black SUVs in my rearview doing that thing where they pretend not to care. I slept with my shoes on and dreamed about my mother asking me if I had eaten. When the funds finished their little journey and arrived at the place they were supposed to, I used a third identity to send them somewhere less theoretical. A split, then a split of the split, then a box within a box within a box until there was a dotted line that said I was a person with means, and a cashier at a bank in a neighborhood where the guards smiled too much asked me if I wanted water. I shook my head and said no because I didn't trust my throat not to fail me. I stood outside in the kind of Los Angeles afternoon where the sky looks expensive and the street feels cheap. I had 5 million reasons to feel invincible and 1 reason not to. I had borrowed them from people who break jaws for late fees. The silence after a win is a lie. Real victories are loud. What I had was a pause before a verdict. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel like it had answers. All I could see was the window closing behind me, swallowing the moment like it never happened. I had touched the bet the city put on my table, and for a second I felt the pulse of it. Then I remembered who else was seated at that table, and what they do to people who forget whose money is whose. The first ripple wasn't a man at my door or a headline. It was a text from the bomber jacket guy that managed to sound both casual and radioactive. He asked if I had seen anything weird during shutdown because accounting had stubbed its toe. I stared at the screen long enough for it to sleep and wake again on its own. I typed nothing because I knew anything I typed would read like a confession. I told myself to be useful. Useful people get to hang around, remember? I wrote back that the feedback loop had been a little nastier than expected, but the crowd never noticed and the manager was happy. I said I'd send a maintenance report. He sent a thumbs up that felt like a camera. 2 days later, the girl on the subwoofer asked me why I looked like I'd walked into a glass door. She liked to dress like a boy and smell like a new car. She worked at a plant shop and lived in a studio where the bed took up half the room and the windows opened to an alley full of other people's habits. She didn't know the words I had started hearing in my head, the names of organizations, the hierarchy inside gangs that operate like churches. She knew when my hands shook and when I lied about what was bothering me. I told her it was taxes. She laughed because she knew I never made enough to worry about taxes. I told her I had a chance at a residency that paid real money. That part, weirdly, was true. Real money attracts itself. It makes you look like someone worth betting on. The ripple spread to rooms I didn't enter. There was a rumor someone had skimmed. Not in my direction. There are always schemes. The rumor named a guy in a polo shirt who liked to talk about crypto at barbecues. I let myself breathe a little. The thing about guilty men is we will take any excuse to feel less guilty for 5 minutes. I let the excuse pat me on the head. I bought groceries without counting. I bought the girl a plant that looked like it could survive a war. I told myself I was moving toward a version of life where $5 million was just a number on a page. Then the bomber jacket guy called. He never called. He always texted like he was allergic to vowels. His voice made it clear that casual was over. A sit-down, he said, like we were playing chess with someone who deserved the courtesy. He made it sound like good news, that they liked my work and wanted to discuss the future. People who want to discuss your future rarely let you choose it. He told me it would be at a diner in Boyle Heights where the coffee is hot for 20 minutes and gets mean after that. He told me who would be there but not the names, just the shapes of them, an uncle, a cousin, a guy who runs things that don't have names. I said yes because I always say yes. Then I threw up in the sink and told the girl I had food poisoning. At the diner, I kept my hands where everyone could see them and drank water like it was a job. The men across from me looked like the city had built them with leftover parts from better men. They weren't scary in the way movies think scary works. They were tired and careful and busy. Busy is terrifying. Busy means hurting you would be a chore, not a pleasure. They asked me 100 little questions about cables and latency, about how one kind of noise differs from another when you look at it long enough. They made me describe my maintenance routine until I hated the sound of my own voice. Then they asked the actual question. Had I noticed anything odd the night of the manual green light? A hiccup beyond the planned hiccup. A shadow next to the ghost. I had anticipated this. I had lines ready about cheap hardware and heat bleed, about the way certain boards throw tantrums if the room hums at the wrong frequency. I had practiced boredom in the mirror. I made sure to repeat certain phrases like a man who wants to sound smarter than he is. I put a little irritation in my tone because professionals get offended when amateurs mess with their toys. They listened and nodded like they had expected me to say exactly that. They didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. They told me the next event would be bigger and that I'd get a bonus, and that I should buy myself something nice because men who take care of themselves take care of their work. They said the name out loud this time, not as a flex but as paperwork. Mexican Mafia. As if they were clarifying the brand manual. I walked out of the diner into a heat that felt like a warning. The ripple had touched me and passed by without breaking the skin. That's what I told myself as I drove to the girl's studio and pretended to nap on her bed like I wasn't listening for boots on the stairs. She asked again what kind of residency pays so much and whether I'd take her to see the space. I told her it wasn't that kind of venue. She looked at me for a long time and said I was getting good at lying to myself. She said it gently, which made it worse. That night I dreamed I was playing to an empty room. The lights were on, which never happens during a set. The ghost rig was speaking in a language I recognized as English but couldn't understand. It kept telling me to stop pressing a button my hands wouldn't stop pressing. When I woke up, the girl was sitting on the floor watering the war plant, and I knew I was going to tell her more than I should. Not because I trusted her with my life. Because I needed someone else to carry 10% of the weight so I could breathe enough to carry the other 90. I didn't tell her the name. I didn't tell her the number. I told her I had helped people move money that wasn't theirs and that I had taken some of it because the system was already stealing, and I might as well be the thief who bought us a future. She didn't cry or moralize. She asked if I had a plan to make it make sense. I said yes. Then she asked if my plan included what would happen if someone else's plan intersected with mine. I said I'd figure it out. She laughed in a way that made me wish I was a better man. She told me plans were just lists of things that haven't happened yet, and that my list sounded like a suicide note without punctuation. I didn't sleep after that. I reorganized my bank boxes in my head and memorized routes out of the city I had no intention of taking. I decided to be brave in the stupid way instead of the smart way. I started thinking about the next event like it was a test I could ace. I believed in my own timing, my own luck, like a man who has never been punched. I told myself if I executed perfectly one more time, the machine would love me too much to eat me. Love from a machine is just heat. It burns whatever it touches. The next event was in a building that used to be a medical clinic, the kind of place where they buy the furniture in bulk and hang fake art with common colors. The lobby smelled like printer ink and fear. We dressed it with uplights and called it an activation because that's what humans do when they want to pretend old sins are new. I kept thinking about the diner, about the way the men's eyes had measured me like I was a package they might have to ship later. I told myself they had believed me. Belief is a cushion you can sleep on for exactly one night. I had promised myself not to do it again. Not the whole thing. I had promised myself to be simple, to take the envelope, to keep being useful. Then I looked at the timing grid and saw another window shaped like a dare. The amount this time was smaller, designed to attract less attention. That should have made it easier to ignore. It made it worse. It whispered that if I could pull a corner without the quilt noticing, the quilt would never know it was smaller. Greed doesn't feel like greed when you dress it in reason. It feels like balance. I built the second ghost smaller, cleaner, with a fuse that burned out in 3 minutes. I told myself I would only do it to test the theory that I hadn't just gotten lucky the first time. That's a sentence I can't believe I thought, let alone lived. I watched the grid light up, I counted my breaths, and I tapped the sequence with a calm I had no right to. I felt the click of it, the soft engagement of gears that weren't supposed to touch. The new digits wrote themselves the way lies write themselves when you've told them enough times to forget the truth. The money moved again, a sliver this time, a test slice. The room didn't notice. The machine smiled at itself. I wiped the rig and left like an altar boy after Mass. I was halfway home when the consequence called. It wasn't the bomber jacket guy. It was the hardware contractor with the chest knight tattoo. His voice was low and flat, the way men talk when they've tripped a wire and are waiting to see if the floor gives. He told me someone had been sniffing around the closet where the network gear sleeps. Someone who had the keys and the right kind of curiosity. He didn't think they knew what they were looking at. He thought they knew there was something to look at. He told me he had moved things an inch this way and that, enough to make a diagram not match a diagram. Enough to buy me hours, not days. He told me he was going to a cousin's wedding and would be hard to reach. That last part was a joke that didn't land. I turned off the music in my car and drove in silence, even though silence made my thoughts louder. The city looked like a stage set with the back peeled off. I wanted to take the money I had split into boxes and flush it down a drain. I wanted to hold it close and call it mine like a child. I wanted to believe there was still a version of this where nobody got hurt. The girl texted me a picture of the plant with a new leaf and wrote that it was stubborn like me. I almost threw my phone out the window from the weight of being seen. The knock came the next morning while I was still in my shoes on the couch. Not boots, sneakers. Two men, not pretending to be anything else. One had the kind of smile you practice in mirrors to get the timing right. The other had polite eyes that made me think of funeral homes. They didn't push past me. They asked if they could come in like solicitors selling a product I didn't need. I stepped aside because the show was over. The polite-eyed man looked around my living room and nodded at the lack of anything worth stealing. He said they needed me to ride with them. He said I wasn't in trouble, they just wanted to walk through some technicals. That phrase should be printed on a t-shirt for men who are about to die. In the SUV, the smile man asked me about signal integrity like he genuinely cared. I told him about heat bleed and tantrum boards and he nodded like we were colleagues. He asked me about the feedback loop at the manual green light 2 events ago, and whether I thought it could have knocked something loose in the watchdog module. I said that was possible. He asked if I liked the coffee at the diner in Boyle Heights. I said it got mean after 20 minutes. He laughed like we were friends. They took me not to a warehouse or a river but to a house in Highland Park with a view of other houses in Highland Park. Inside, a woman in running shoes and a hoodie sat behind a dining table with paper spread out like a craft project. She didn't look up when we came in. She said my name like it wasn't my name anymore, like she was saying the word tool. She told me to sit and watch a screen. The screen showed logs. The logs showed the cough. The cough showed the hiccup I had planned. Then the scroll got delicate. It showed a blip inside the blip, a fingerprint of a second ghost small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, obvious if you knew it had to be there. She didn't ask me if it was mine. She didn't ask me why. She asked me who else knew. That made me hate her for being so efficient. I told the truth because lying is expensive, and I was out of credit. I said the hardware contractor knew enough to be a problem and not enough to solve it. She nodded like she had a list, and I had just confirmed the order. She told the polite-eyed man to get the contractor. She told the smile man to take my phone and my keys. She told me to breathe normally because she hated when people performed panic. I tried. I failed. She explained the situation with the calm of a kindergarten teacher. I had done something clever and unforgivable. The organization that tolerated me had a decision to make about whether it preferred to show mercy or expertise. Killing me would be expertise. Keeping me alive would be a mercy that needed to yield a dividend. She said the number 5 million like it was a bus schedule. She said there would be a meeting with a person who disliked meetings. She told me I had one chance to make a speech that would be the difference between teeth and gravel and a future where my hands still worked. I thought about the girl and the new leaf. I thought about my mother, and the way she once asked me if I liked my work and I said I did, and she said she was glad I had found something that kept me out late. I thought about the shoe soles I had worn down in rooms where people shouted for songs they couldn't name. I thought about the feeling of the 8-minute window clicking into place, and the way victory lies quietly in your stomach like a small bomb that thinks it is love. I told the hoodie woman I could make them more money, cleaner and quieter, with less risk and fewer eyes on the process. The words came out like a prayer and a sales pitch had a child. She listened. She wrote a few things down. She told me mercy is factored, not gifted. She told me to wait in a room with a treadmill and a view of a backyard where a dog was losing its mind about a squirrel. I waited. I listened to my heart try to leave my body through my throat. The men came back with the contractor between them and his chest night looked like it wanted to jump off his skin. He saw me and didn't look surprised. He asked me with his eyes whether we were already dead. I didn't have an answer because I wasn't in charge anymore. They put us in front of a man who didn't bother with names. He wasn't big or loud or cinematic. He was busy. He asked the hoodie woman if she had the logs. He glanced at them for less than a second. He turned to me and asked whether I liked living. It wasn't a question that deserved language, so I nodded. He told me the organization would take its money back with interest. Then he did something I didn't expect. He asked me for a number I believed I could move in 90 days that would make my mistake feel like seed capital instead of theft. I said a number that was too big because fear makes men ambitious. He nodded like he appreciated the audacity. He told me if I hit it, we could talk about forgiveness. If I missed, the organization would demonstrate expertise. I walked out with my hands in my teeth. That felt like a win until I realized all I had done was buy time. Time is a currency that evaporates. I drove to the girl's studio and told her enough for her to either leave me or yell at me. She didn't do either. She asked me what my 90-day number was. I told her. She whistled without smiling. She said we would need a strategy that wasn't just hope and momentum. She said we were going to have to treat my sin like a startup. I wanted to laugh at how stupid that sounded. I didn't. We made a whiteboard out of a mirror and wrote our future backward. We listed venues, shell companies, timing vulnerabilities, and the names of people who think they are smarter than they are. We plotted a flow of money that never existed or existed too much. We treated the organization like a client. We treated survival like a product. The thing about building anything is that once you start, you love it even if it's wrong. I loved the plan. That made me dangerous to myself. I stopped being a DJ. I still played rooms, but my shows were scented candles for the real work. I became a scheduler, an accountant for shadows, a project manager for the parts of a city that only wake up after dark. I learned more about payment gateways than any musician should. I learned which regulators didn't schedule enough sleep and which ones were divorced and happy to take long lunches. I learned the shape of a legitimate invoice and how to build a fake one that would pass a casual glance. I learned that most frauds don't fail because they're bad at lying. They fail because they tell the truth at the wrong time. The 90-day number hung above me like weather. The bomber jacket guy was replaced by a man in a neat polo who smelled like chewing gum and gym floors. The hoodie woman appeared in my life irregularly, always in running shoes as if she might bolt. The polite eyes man turned out to be the only one I could talk to without wanting to scream. He told me that inside any large operation there are departments that hate each other and departments that hate the world, and I should aim my cleverness at the former to avoid the latter. It was the closest thing to advice I was ever given. I built a laundering chain that felt like a Rube Goldberg joke. Every step was simple enough to explain to a bored auditor. No single step looked like it could carry evil. Together, they were a river. We moved sums through nonprofit campaigns that never existed, through influencer agencies that did but couldn't tell the difference, through vendor prepayments that sat on balance sheets like lazy cats. We parked money in the hollow trees of holding companies and then set fires miles away as a distraction. I told myself the organization would be impressed with the elegance. I forgot that busy men don't have time for elegance unless it breaks. The girl became my co-conspirator even though I didn't ask her to. She said she couldn't watch me drown from the shore. She learned more about wire instructions than anyone who stocks soil should. She took a temp job at a logistics outfit I needed eyes on and found the one clerk whose password was a pet's name. She came back smelling like forklifts and told me we could shave 2 days off our float if we used Thursdays. She kissed me like we were surviving, not living. I told her when we hit the 90-day number we would move to a neighborhood where the dog in the backyard would be ours. She asked me if we named the dog after a saint or a sin. I said both. The first month, the numbers thrilled the hoodie woman. She didn't smile, but her sentences got shorter, which I chose to read as pleased. The second month, the neat polo man started asking questions that lived in the space between respect and suspicion. He wanted to know who had recruited me for the original Ghost. He wanted to know whether I had enemies. He wanted to know where the $5 million was now that it wasn't theirs. I told him it was in the river like everything else. He didn't believe me. He didn't need to. He was not the type to chase truths that didn't pay. The contractor with the chest knight tattoo kept pace because he had no choice. We paid him too much and too little at the same time. Too much for the job he thought he was doing, too little for the danger he was actually in. He never said it, but I knew he was waiting for the day when the chain snapped and the part tied to his ankle yanked him into the water. He asked me once, after a long night when we had moved numbers that felt obscene, if I believed in luck. I told him luck believes in me. He didn't laugh. He told me luck runs out when it realizes you take it for granted. We hit the 90-day number with 9 days to spare. I should have felt relief. All I felt was a vacuum, like the air had been pulled out of the room and the floor was making decisions without me. The hoodie woman called a meeting in a room that pretended to be a co-working space and laid out my future like a meal I wasn't hungry for. Forgiveness prorated. Continued employment contingent. A carve-out for my girl and the plant shop if I needed leverage. I didn't know what that meant until she explained they knew where she worked and who owned the building. Mercy factored, not gifted. Forgiveness came with hooks. The neat polo man told me I was valuable and the organization rewards value by keeping it close. Close meant reachable, which is another word for leash. He told me if I wanted to exit, I could build my own replacement. He said it like a joke. I knew it wasn't. He wanted me to teach someone how to be me and then disappear as if that wouldn't follow me wherever I hid. I nodded because nodding was my only currency left. The girl started packing the studio like we were moving even though we weren't. She wanted to pretend there was a finish line and it had a door. She asked me where we'd go. I said a place without windows that look at places we recognize. She said that sounded like a bunker, not a home. She told me if I wanted her to leave me to save herself, this was her last chance to do it clean. I told her I needed her more than I deserved her. She rolled her eyes like a woman bored with heroics. She stayed. What I had built was a machine that needed feeding. Even with the 90-day number met, the pipeline couldn't just go dark. Darkness attracts flashlights. We had to ramp it down like a decent addict. The hoodie woman agreed in theory, and then told me theory doesn't pay for the things that keep people loyal. The neat polo man wanted to widen the pipes. The polite eyes man stayed quiet. I learned to read quiet as despair. If you want to know when I understood I wasn't getting out, it wasn't a gun or a grave. It was a spreadsheet labeled with my name in a folder I wasn't supposed to see. It listed my value in real numbers and fake ones, the way they'd pay me and the way they had already paid me without me noticing. It listed the leverage points like bullet points on a resume: girlfriend, mother, contractor, vulnerabilities and temperament. It was the kind of document smart companies keep for high performers. I had become a high performer in a place where the reward for excellence is a cage with nicer lighting. I lay awake and tried to imagine a new move, something elegant that would neutralize the math. All I came up with was fire. Fire is the oldest exit strategy. Burn the logs, burn the identities, burn the chain until the air stinks and the machine coughs blood. Fire has its own math. It requires sacrifice. Usually yourself. The burn plan wasn't noble. It was desperate. It depended on a kind of blindness that only appears in people who believe they are winning. I started with small arsons. Not literal flame, not yet. I corrupted checksum libraries in ways that read like version drift. I made tiny mismatches between vendor IDs and their W-9s, the kind of random pain that bloats a back office without tripping a siren. I made the machine tired. Tired machines make the mistakes you need them to make to justify reboots. The contractor put his night to work. He spent nights in closets mapping which cables had learned to love each other, and which ones could be split in a way that would make a camera shrug. He taught me how to listen to a room not with my ears but with a meter, and to mark the hums that meant something could be severed without a scream. We ate stale chips and left fingerprints on nothing. We built a wall of plausible deniability out of dust and insomnia. The girl became my quartermaster. She packed go bags with the kind of attention to detail you only see in people who have watched the worst thing happen once and decided not to allow it again. She found us routes through the city that didn't look like routes. She made friends with a woman who worked nights at a pet clinic and would let us in through the back door if we needed to disappear somewhere that smelled like bleach and sadness. She told me if we did this, we'd be new people afterward. She didn't say whether she thought the new people would be better. The first real blaze was digital. A master reconciliation file that tied our river to the ocean got sick and died on a Wednesday at noon. The hoodie woman saw it immediately and called me with a tone that suggested interest without accusation. I told her I had seen checksum drift that could cause cascading failures. I said we should pause the big pipes and let the small ones run. She hesitated and then said to do it. The neat polo man hated it. He liked wide pipes. He liked the physics of dominion. He sent the polite eyes man to stand behind me while I worked as if eyes could stop entropy. I had 3 days while the machine counted to itself. In those 3 days, I executed the human part of the burn plan. I visited my mother in a suburb that had held its breath since 1998. I told her I was taking a job out of state. She looked at me and said she had always known the city would either make me or digest me. She gave me a ceramic mug that said California in a font that had never been cool. She told me to drink water. I wanted to tell her everything. I told her nothing and cried in the car where nobody could sell my tears back to me. I met the contractor on a roof and watched the freeway move like a slow animal. He told me he had a way out through a cousin who worked jobs that end in deserts. He told me he would take it. He didn't ask if I wanted to come. He knew I hadn't finished building the fire. He gave me a drive and told me it contained an ugly truth about a person who wore a hoodie and ran well. Insurance, he called it. I didn't want it. I took it. The second blaze smelled like gasoline. Not literally. It smelled like a donation funnel that had been turned off too quickly, like contributors who didn't exist filing complaints that did. It smelled like a journalist's inbox catching a scent. I didn't leak anything. I just aligned certain blunt objects and stood back while gravity did what it does. The machine focused its attention outward. Outward attention is an opportunity. I took the 5 million, or what was left of it after boxes and splits and time had nibbled it, and I froze it. Not with a bank. With a man who buries things no one wants to find. He charged me a fee that sounded like a threat. He told me he didn't care who I owed as long as I didn't tell him names. He asked me if the money felt like a friend yet. I told him it felt like wet clothes. He laughed and said I was a poet. I told him I was a DJ with a problem. The hoodie woman called another meeting. Her sentences were longer again, which I took as worry. She told me the river would restart with a new ocean. She told me we were changing vendors, systems, the names of departments nobody uses. She told me I would migrate our cleverness, and that we would call it a compliance upgrade. She was good at this, the theater of normal. She said almost as an aside that if any of us were thinking about leaving, now would be a stupid time. I was thinking about leaving. I took her aside after and gave her the ugly truth drive the contractor had handed me and told her it was none of my business. She looked at me like a teacher who knows you're cheating but appreciates the attempt at courtesy. She didn't thank me. She told me to sleep. I didn't. I drove circles in a city that had stopped pretending it was anyone's friend. I went to the girl's studio and lay on the floor and tried to count the number of decisions that had led me here. I got to 4 before I wanted to throw up. She lay next to me and took my hand and told me she was in as long as and meant we eventually got out. I told her and meant alive tomorrow. She said that was enough math for now. I lit the last fire quietly. I cut a line that couldn't be cut without being noticed, and then I restored it with a lag that couldn't be explained without opening a box nobody wanted to open. The hoodie woman called me, and this time she didn't hide the accusation. She said someone inside was playing amateur magician. I said if they wanted me to fix it, I'd need to turn off the lights for an hour. She laughed and told me the organization doesn't turn off lights for anyone. Then, 10 minutes later, the lights went off. In the dark, I moved the last pieces into place. I didn't steal more. I didn't reroute anything. I made the machine cough blood. Enough to scare the men who like wide pipes. Enough to convince them the smartest thing was to pause and consider a different hobby for a week. Enough to make a quiet escape look like a scheduled maintenance window. I told myself I was being noble by not taking more. Nobility is just cowardice with better PR. The truth is I was too scared to press my luck. When the lights came back on, the neat polo man was sweating through the neat. The polite eyes man looked at me like we were at an airport saying goodbye. The hoodie woman stood very still, which scared me more than shouting would have. She told me to go home and stand by. I did, which is a sentence that contains both defeat and hope. At home, the girl had 2 bags by the door. She handed me a baseball cap that wasn't mine and told me to put it on. She said we had to go now, while everyone believed the narrative they liked best. She said whatever forgiveness had been on offer was gone. She said I always wanted an exit song, this was it. I picked up the bags and realized I had no more excuses left. I was ready to leave a city that had never promised me anything except a view. We didn't go far. That's what you learn when you're being hunted by busy people. Distance is romance. Disguise is math. We stayed in the city, in a part of it that pretends to be a different city. We checked into a motel where the lights buzzed like insects and paid cash with a smile that said we were cheating on someone. The girl slept in her shoes. I watched the door and rehearsed stories about who we were that might convince a tired clerk to not notice us. I had a number to call if the machine decided expertise over mercy. It led to a man who could erase what the DMV knows and replace it with something less accurate. I didn't call. Every call is a breadcrumb. Instead, I did the cowardly brave thing and texted the polite eyes man. I told him the river had poisoned itself and I was getting out of the water. He took 15 minutes to reply. He said he understood and that he hoped I understood he couldn't help me. I told him hope was the only thing I had left that didn't come with a receipt. He sent me an address and then 5 minutes later said to ignore it. I memorized it anyway. The contractor disappeared. Not the kind of disappeared where there's a post about it. The kind where you check the closets you used to share and they're empty in a way that suggests a plan. I took that as a blessing I didn't deserve. The hoodie woman didn't call. The neat polo man did. He asked me to come in for a friendly. He said the word friendly like a hotel towel. I told him I was sick. He told me to feel better. There was a silence after that goodbye that felt like a ledger closing. The exit song is never the one you think it will be. It's not the anthem you played at 2 a.m. when the kids finally found each other. It's not the one the couple requested at the wedding because it was theirs before it was anybody else's. My exit song was the sound of tires on the 5 at 3 in the morning, a hiss that said forward is just a direction, not a guarantee. We drove to the address the polite eyes man had told me to ignore. It was a storage facility that didn't look like denial. It looked like profit. Unit 217, which is the kind of number that pretends to mean nothing. Inside was a duffel with clothes in sizes that guessed too big and a folder with paperwork that belonged to a man I had never been. There was also a note that said dogs are cheaper than alarm systems. It wasn't signed. We became the man I had never been and the woman who loved him. We moved through the city in diagonal lines. We ate in restaurants where the music is too loud to have a conversation you'll regret. We made a list of the places we could be found and didn't go to any of them. I thought about my mother and the ceramic mug and whether I would ever see either again. I thought about the dog we'd promised ourselves. I thought about the 5 million I had buried with a man who loved the smell of bleach. I didn't think about the organization because thinking about something that can reach you is an invitation. The call came not to me but to the girl. A voice that didn't bother pretending said they were looking for me and thought she might be lonely without me. She hung up and looked at me like I was the edge of a cliff. We packed again. We moved again. The city is big enough to hold a dozen versions of you if you keep your stories straight. We were on version 3, maybe 4. Every version was thinner, like bad copies. We lasted a week like that before the math broke. You can't stay in motion forever without turning into a circle. Circles invite pattern recognition. We crossed the street in Echo Park and I saw the neat polo man sitting on a bench eating something from a paper tray. He looked up at me and didn't look surprised. He didn't stand. He didn't call anyone. He finished his food and wiped his mouth and nodded in a way that said a chapter had ended. He pointed at me with the hand that held the napkin and then pointed at the street like he was offering me a choice. I took the street and didn't look back. Back at the motel, the girl told me she was done being the brave one. She said if I wanted her with me, it had to be a with that look like tomorrow, not just tonight. She said if I had a chess move left, now was the time to move the knight. I thought about the drive with the ugly truth, about the hoodie woman's running shoes, about Mercy factored. I thought about the buried money and the man who loves bleach. I thought about the polite eyes and the storage unit and the dog. I made a call I had sworn not to make. I used a payphone that smelled like old rain and dialed a number that ended with 3 zeros because men like that think it looks important. A voice I didn't recognize told me to speak. I told the voice I had an exchange to propose. Information for amnesty. Not forgiveness. Just a corridor with lights long enough to get me and the girl through a door. There was a pause. The voice asked me for a word that proved I wasn't wasting his time. I said the hoodie woman's real name. I had learned it from the drive. The line made a sound like thinking. They didn't say yes. They said a place and a time. They said bring nothing but the truth. People who say that mean bring something we can sell later. I brought the ugly truth and the part of me that still believed in doors. The place was a park that people use as a shortcut between errands. The time was when the dog walkers finish and the lunch crowd hasn't started. I wore clothes from the duffel and a face that tried to be unremarkable. The girl sat on a bench 2 away and read a magazine she didn't care about. I held the drive in my pocket like a talisman that might decide it hates me. The man who met me didn't wear a polo or a hoodie. He wore a jacket that fit and shoes that were expensive enough to explain nothing. He sat without asking and stared at the pigeons like they had answers. He told me this wasn't charity. I told him I knew. He told me I was either the bravest coward he'd ever met or the dumbest genius. I told him it depended on the song. Then I put the drive on the bench between us and slid it toward him like I was offering a cigarette. He asked me if I still had the 5 million. I told him most of it. He asked me if I wanted to keep it. I told him I wanted a life where I didn't turn on the shower to cover the sound of my own heart. He considered that like it was a business proposal. He told me the organization doesn't do amnesty. It does asset allocation. He said he could allocate me to a location far enough that I'd have to learn a new grocery store layout. He said in exchange the organization would become the new owner of my wet clothes. He said the hoodie woman would run in a different direction for a while. He said the neat polo man would find a new wide pipe. He said the polite eyes man would pretend not to recognize me if we ever bought avocados in the same aisle. He said the girl could keep the plant. He said he wanted an answer now. I don't know if there is a right choice in a moment like that. There's only the choice that lets you keep moving. I told him to take the money and send me somewhere to forget my own name. He smiled without showing teeth. He told me to stop being dramatic. He told me to meet a man behind a laundromat in Montebello at dusk and say the words overdue library book. He stood up and walked away with my ugly truth like it was a USB full of family photos. I went to the girl and told her the plan. She didn't ask me if I was sure. She had stopped asking that the day she dug through a trash bag to find a receipt I needed to falsify a timeline. We checked out of the motel and returned the key to a kid who didn't look up from his phone. We drove to Montebello and parked behind a laundromat that smelled like heat and soap and regret. The man who met us there had tattooed eyelids and a calmness I would pay to rent. I said the words. He nodded and put a bag in our trunk. It held envelopes with new names and a map with a circle around a town so ordinary the weather probably apologized for being nothing. We didn't leave that night. We went back to the studio one last time. We watered the plant and left the ceramic mug in the cabinet like a breadcrumb I knew I'd never use. I wrote a letter to my mother that said I had taken a job somewhere without freeways and that I would call when it was safe. I didn't say safe for who. I put the letter in a mailbox that probably only ever held flyers and jury summonses. I stood on the sidewalk and felt the city decide whether it was going to bless me or spit me out. It chose the latter, which is another kind of blessing. We drove east until the skyline was a rumor. We stopped at a diner where the coffee was good for the first 20 minutes and mean after that. We ate scrambled eggs that made us both feel like morning. We looked at each other like survivors instead of lovers. I told her I was sorry for being the kind of man who mistook momentum for destiny. She told me sorrow was a tax and we had overpaid. We kept going until the map matched the circle. The town we landed in had a main street that didn't know it was supposed to be ironic. We rented a place with a porch and a dog that came with it. The dog answered to both saint and sin. The girl got a job at a garden center where the plants have names on tags. I found work fixing sound in a church where the microphones don't want to cooperate. On Sundays, I play music quietly and nobody asks for a drop. Sometimes I miss the nights when a room would lift me and I would let it. Mostly I don't. The organization hasn't called. That's not mercy. That's busy. I watch the news less. I scroll even less than that. I have learned how to make coffee that is good past 20 minutes. The plant with the stubborn leaf didn't make the trip. The girl brought a cutting. It's trying. I took $5 million from the Mexican Mafia and gave it back like a man handing over a stolen wallet at a memorial. I kept what I needed, which turned out to be less than I thought. I left behind a city that taught me how to listen and a version of myself that mistook risk for personality. I don't think I'm a good person now. I think I'm a person who got tired of being brave in this stupid way. When the dog barks at night, I still flinch. When the sun hits the porch just right, I forget why. If you were waiting for a lesson, I don't have one you can put on a shirt. I can tell you only this: windows close, machines eat, and love is the only ledger that doesn't try to balance itself. The rest is noise, and I spent too long confusing noise with music. If this story held you all the way through, hit like and subscribe. There are more confessions out there, and I'll keep telling them while the lights are still on.